So this month I wanted to talk about fairy tales. And let me just start off by saying that if the only fairy tales you're familiar with are the Disney princess movies, you are missing out so much. Those are 20th and 21st century, cleaned up, sanitized, child-friendly versions of a few specific stories. But there is so much more out there. As far as fairy tales in the sense of traditional folk tales passed down through generations around the world, usually involving some magical or supernatural aspects. Originally, my plan was to make one video talking about my favorite fairy tales that Disney hasn't made movie adaptations of. But then it kind of got out of hand, and I ended up with way too much content for just one video, so now the plan is a series of 4 videos posted in consecutive weeks. Definitely stay tuned for more. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 5 specific fairy tales that Disney has not adapted, or that Disney has not adapted as full feature-length movies along the lines of, say, Snow White, or Tangled, or Beauty and the Beast, or whatever. The first fairy tale that I want to talk about is called East of the Sun and West of the Moon. This story starts when a poor man offers his youngest daughter to a talking bear in exchange for wealth. Parents in fairy tales often are not really very considerate of their children and make choices that seriously impact their children's lives without consulting them first. But the youngest daughter agrees to go with the bear, and the family does become wealthy. It actually turns out, luckily for the daughter, that the bear is actually a man under a curse, and that he can transform into a human at night and is only a bear during the daytime. However, she can't actually see him, because if any light were to fall on him, bad things would happen. She eventually ends up going back to see her family, and she is persuaded to use a candle to try and look at him while he's sleeping to see what he looks like. I mean, personally, I think that if I were living with a strange guy that was a bear during the day, I would want to see what he looked like too. But in any case, this activates the curse. He has to go live with his wicked stepmother and marry her daughter, and this sends our protagonist on this just epic quest to get him back. This story has shades of Beauty and the Beast to it in terms of the woman who is in love with a man that is under a curse that transforms him into something not human, but it actually has a lot more resemblance to the Greek myth of Cupid and Psyche. One thing worth mentioning is that in contrast to the general stereotype of the damsel in distress and the daring young prince or commoner or knight or whatever who saves her, this story is actually one where the young woman goes on a quest to save the man. So I think that that's kind of an interesting reversal of expectations. The next one that I want to talk about is called The Six Swans. Animal transformations, particularly into certain animals, including swans, are pretty common in fairy tales. Now, you might be surprised to know that the movie The Swan Princess is actually based on a ballet and not really on a fairy tale, but there are plenty of fairy tales that involve someone who's under a curse to transform into an animal. This one is kind of unique because it's not like the kiss a frog and he'll turn into a prince and marry you thing, although the Frog Prince story actually doesn't involve kissing the frog. That's the kind of child-friendly modernized version that does that. In the version by the Grimm brothers, she throws the frog against the wall and it dies and then it turns into a human. But I'm getting sidetracked there. Anyway, what I was trying to get at is that The Six Swans is not about someone saving their romantic love interest from being transformed as an animal. In this case, it's actually the protagonist's siblings, her 6 brothers, who have been transformed into swans. And she is tasked with breaking the curse by sewing shirts out of a certain kind of flowers, as well as keeping absolutely silent for a certain number of years. She's able to do this despite great obstacles in her path, but she ends up in a situation where, because she's unable to speak, she's been accused of a serious crime and can't defend herself. It's kind of an overwhelming coincidence that the final day of the curse and the day in which she's able to free her brothers is the same day she's supposed to be burned at the stake, but the timing all works out in a very lovely way. One of the most iconic images from this fairy tale is the youngest brother, who she's not quite able to finish his shirt in time. And so instead of being transformed entirely from a swan back into a human being, he keeps one wing in place of an arm. It's kind of an interesting bit of imagery that makes this story memorable. Another interesting fairy tale, and kind of a creepy one, is the story of Vasilisa the Beautiful. It's a Russian fairy tale about a young girl whose mother passes away and whose father remarries to a stepmother who has two daughters of her own. But if you think that this is Cinderella and everything is going to be solved by a night of dancing at the ball, you would be wrong. In this one, the girl has a doll that was given to her by her mother, and when the stepmother makes her complete difficult tasks, the doll helps her with them. Eventually, the stepmother and stepdaughters conspire to put out all the lights in the house and send her to Baba Yaga's hut in order to get more light. Baba Yaga is an interesting character from Russian folklore, and there's way too much about her to go into right now, but let's just say she lives in a hut that walks around on chicken legs, and she can be helpful at times, but she can also be extremely dangerous. Vasilisa's family is going for the dangerous angle. They don't want her to come back. But the young girl is able to pass Baba Yaga's tests, and the doll is able to warn her about what questions not to ask and how to handle different things. And eventually she is given a lantern made out of a skull with light in it, and she is sent home, where the fire from the lantern proceeds to burn her stepfamily to a crisp, leaving her, not having to worry about them anymore, and then she eventually gets married to a czar. So it starts off like Cinderella, but it goes a completely different path, and then kind of cycles back around in the end with the whole marrying into royalty thing. You may have heard of the story The Elves and the Shoemaker, but did you know that it's actually one of 3 stories grouped together under the title The Elves in the Grimm Brothers collection? It's story number 39, but it's only a small part of that. The first of the 3 stories tells the typical story of the elves and the shoemaker, the man who leaves out the materials to make shoes at night, and in the morning he finds that, the shoes have been made and they're ready to sell, and that enables his business to prosper. Eventually, he and his wife decide that they want to know what's going on, so they spy at night and see little elves doing it. And then they decide, because the elves are naked, or in some kids' picture books like wearing rags, they decide to make clothes for them, and it all goes downhill from there. The second one is the story of a servant girl who's invited to participate in a christening ceremony for the elves. She's taken under the mountain where they live, and she participates in the ceremony, and she stays for 3 days. However, when she returns to the human world, she finds that actually 7 years have passed. In that time, the people that she worked for have passed away, and new people have moved into their house. Wow, that must have been a crazy 3 days. And then the third story involves a changeling child, a child left by elves or fairies or trolls or whatever in place of a human baby. This one is relatively tame as far as changeling child stories go. Sometimes they get really gruesome. In this one, the method that's chosen for revealing the child as a changeling is boiling water in eggshells. This causes the creature to start laughing and to say that in all the time that it's been alive, which has been, way longer than the few months that an infant would have been, it's never seen anything like that. It's then swapped back by the fairies for the human child that they had taken. I think it's interesting that these stories show a different side of elves than we normally expect in the modern day. I think most people, when they think of elves, think of either Lord of the Rings elves or like Christmas elves, but these are something entirely different. They're mysterious, unpredictable, not necessarily friendly. Even if they don't seem to think that there's a problem, they can cause you problems, like the girl who went to the christening under the mountain and came out 7 years later when she thought it'd been 3 days. Like I said about the Changeling Child one, all 3 of the stories are relatively tame when it comes to old stories about elves or fairies. There definitely are ones that are much more just absolutely nightmare-worthy. But I do think it's interesting that fairy tales we often think of as like, the benevolent fairy godmother, but this aspect of what elves or fairies used to be thought of as would have made it in. And then finally, the last one that I want to talk about is, you might be surprised by this, Little Red Riding Hood. Did you know that there is a short film by Disney from way back in the day that involves Little Red Riding Hood, but I cannot believe that there's not like a full-length Disney princess type movie about Little Red Riding Hood. It just seems like the sort of story that it's astonishing that they haven't snapped it up sooner. I mean, granted, she's not a princess, but then neither are a lot of the Disney princesses, actually. Then again, Little Red Riding Hood features a much younger child than a lot of fairy tales. Not a young woman where it could be a love story, but a child that's just wandering through the woods with a basket for Granny. And the ending is pretty gruesome no matter which version you go with. I mean, you could do like my mother when I was a kid and tell the version where the grandmother was locked in the closet and they all lived happily ever after. But, you know, that's not how it traditionally goes. In some versions, Little Red Riding Hood does not survive her encounter with the wolf. And in some versions, she does, but her grandmother doesn't. The absolute absurdity of cutting a wolf's stomach open and there being two people who have been eaten, totally alive and unharmed in there, is really weird too. So yeah, maybe I can see why there's not a Disney princess movie based on that. Anyway, more fairy tales are soon to come, but to start off with, those are 5 stories that I think are really interesting despite being a little bit lesser known, or in some cases well known but not adapted in like a popular full-length Disney movie.